In many circumstances, we require distributed transactions to support the separation of state logic across isolated service boundaries. In this video, we will be describing the fundamental requirements for achieving distributed transactions and the methods available to integrate with legacy systems that don't favor these requirements. We will define and distinguish what I call legacy IOC systems with more flexible HAC systems. We'll observe the limitations of composability between these systems and devise an architectural strategy to overcome these limitations. We'll notice further complications with this strategy that make universal adoption infeasible and consider that a suitable area for further research. Finally, we'll glance at some resemblances with smart contract technology. So this video is also available in article form, so the link to that is going to be in the description below, so please do check that out. And I recommend you familiarize yourself with distributed transactions and multi-phase commits before watching the rest of this video. Now, you don't need a perfect understanding, but the better understanding you have, the easier it will be to follow along. So first, let's quickly recap the concepts of both transactions and distributed transactions. So a transaction is an indivisible unit of work composed of multiple operations which either all succeed or all fail. We'd like to prevent this possibility of entering a so-called illegal state, so that's an in-between state with operations only partially applied. So a transaction contains a special safety mechanism that guarantees such an unintended scenario will not occur. So a simple example of a transaction would be a monetary transfer, so that consists of the crediting of one account and the simultaneous debiting of another. So a monetary transfer must never be in a partially completed state. So the sum of all balances across accounts cannot fluctuate. So if we take a snapshot of the sum of all balances across accounts, this must remain fixed. We can't accidentally create more value out of thin air or destroy value without making an appropriate record for that. Okay, so with transactions out of the way, let's move on to distributed transactions. So a distributed transaction refers to a transaction that operates across systems that are highly separated at either the physical level, the logical level, or both. Each of its constituent operations may be running on an entirely different machine. Distributed transactions often involve incredibly high transaction times due to network latency, and hence require thorough design and unique architectural considerations. Special protocols must be devised between systems to allow for the safe and reliable implementation of atomicity in such a way that faulty or non-compliant systems have a limited scope for disruption. So transactions are useful for preventing a system from entering an illegal state that doesn't make sense programmatically. Instead, they enable us to confine state possibilities to those arising from strictly defined paths. Distributed transactions are valuable when this level of rigidity is desired in horizontally layered or globally distributed applications. Now, whether distributed transactions are indeed needed in your scenario is not the subject of this video. So now we'll move on to looking at some common techniques for distributed transactions. There are two primary mechanisms to achieve distributed transactions, which we will summarize briefly. The first is two-phase commits, which involves splitting up transactions into two phases, the preparation phase and the commitment phase. The first phase is to prepare each operation of the transaction. This involves asking the system corresponding to each operation to offer an irrevocable right to commit or apply the respective operation. Each system is temporarily disallowed from altering state in such a way that might break this guarantee. Once we get a thumbs up from each system, we enter the second phase where we commit each operation. If, however, we don't get a thumbs up for a particular operation, we can choose not to execute our right and instead abort each operation. This means we will either commit all operations or abort all operations and nothing in between, maintaining our desired atomicity. This allows the transactional nature to be maintained, but potentially with the cost of massive latency and lengthy locking times. This depends how efficiently you can implement your solution. The second solution is to pretend like the system behaves in a transactional manner even if it doesn't quite. If the system enters an undesired in-between state, we must generate compensating operations to be eventually applied. These operations are usually done with the intent to roll back the system to a previous state. In the meantime, we must be careful not to expose the in-between state to any service that expects otherwise. However, not all integrations may require this level of transactional strictness, which can make the strategy that bit more enticing. A nice way to look at it is that the transactional nature of a system can only be stated with respect to a particular interface being exposed, irrespective of any internal non-transactional elements. As such, we can introduce fancy mechanisms to make a system appear transactional on the outside, as the public-facing interface is what counts. Next, we ask ourselves what are the fundamental requirements for achieving distributed transactions. In its ideal form, distributed transactions must allow for the arbitrary composition of operations across independent systems. It is this ideal form that we are interested in today's video. In this case, multiphase becomes a fundamental requirement to support the composition process. This is no different to regular transactions, which are still kind of logically distributed in a sense, but across components in close physical proximity. Here, multiple phases go unnoticed under the hood due to everything being implemented so tightly, resulting in no observable downside. On the other hand, the multiphase approach bites us in several respects when it comes to distributed systems. One key difference is the extent to which latency and other network characteristics affect the favorability of particular strategies. Another difference, and an especial challenge, is having to account for integration across trust boundaries in an efficient and resilient manner, which we'll elaborate on later. These challenges cause systems to sacrifice support for arbitrarily composed distributed transactions by exposing only basic interfaces for their operations instead. This can be rather disheartening for those passionate about the versatility of distributed composition. We'll now look in detail at the two types of operation interfaces a system can expose and observe the limited potential for composability between them. So any system that processes state-altering operations can expose these operations in two ways. The first, which I consider a legacy strategy, is IOC, immediate or cancel. I've borrowed this terminology from financial trading systems as I think it's appropriate here, simply meaning that the system will attempt to perform the operation at the exact time of request, and it will either succeed or fail. Although such systems can perform these operations atomically perfectly well, one cannot easily compose larger transactions out of multiple IOC operations, since there is no specialized mechanism to allow for this. IOC operations follow a mere fire and forget approach. The second strategy is what I choose to call HAC, hold and commit. This entails the administration of two-phase commits. HAC allows for larger transactions to be composed across such systems, which is essential for a composable distributed architecture. This can be seen by the fact that smaller HAC operations can form part of a larger HAC transaction, where the preparation and commitment phases can easily be implemented by relaying these requests to the constituent parts. Although IOC systems are widespread, we consider IOC systems to be legacy systems when it comes to a distributed architecture, as they don't support the fundamental requirements for distributed transactions. IOC systems simply do not play nicely with arbitrary transaction composition. Nevertheless, we aim to look at how we can incorporate such legacy systems into an otherwise distributed architecture. This is because we must oftentimes interact with external IOC systems out of our control, making it important to study the ability to integrate with them. Next, let's look at the narrow feasibility of two different solutions to IOC integration. So solution 1 is looking at the narrow scope of direct IOC composability. Solution 2, on the other hand, will be considering the idea of IOC promotion. So let's begin with solution 1. So recall that in our goal for transaction composition, we would like to use smaller transactions as building blocks for larger transactions. Notice that it is trivial to compose a larger HAC transaction from multiple HAC operations across separate systems by taking advantage of multi-phase commits. However, if a particular operation of interest is IOC, we know it's impossible to incorporate this as part of a larger HAC transaction. This is very limiting as foreign systems are often IOC. Take banking services or external integrations, for instance. So the question is, what can we do about this? So there is actually a limited IOC composability rule we can take advantage of. Notice carefully that it is possible to combine HAC operations with at most one IOC operation to produce a larger transaction. In particular, the resulting transaction will itself only be IOC. We can achieve this by preparing all HAC operations, and if accepted, only then perform the IOC operation. Depending on the IOC operation's result status, we can then choose to commit or abort the previous HAC operations. This allows for all operations to be executed in one atomic batch, but the resulting transaction is unfortunately IOC and not itself HAC. So to summarise, a larger HAC transaction must consist of other HAC operations, whereas a larger IOC transaction can be made up of at most one IOC operation, with the rest needing to be HAC. This little snippet here of rule definitions describes the same, where star means 0 or more, plus means 1 or more, and question mark means at most 1. So here for the HAC rule, we can recursively have as many HAC operations as we like, whereas for the IOC rule, we can have as many HAC operations as we like, but only at most one IOC operation. This limited IOC composability rule can occasionally allow us to integrate with legacy systems within a distributed architecture, provided there is no need to further expose HAC. This may be applicable near the front end where there is direct end-user interaction. So now we'll move on to another solution, which is IOC promotion. So the idea of this solution is to artificially promote an IOC operation into a HAC operation. We can create a sort of wrapper operation, pretending like this operation behaves as HAC. Similar to what we described earlier on in the video, we can create compensating operations if a prepared operation ends up being aborted. It can be incredibly challenging to implement this effectively, but we can't rule out its suitability in particular circumstances. We may also choose to include specialized logic to order the operations in such a way that a promoted IOC operation is executed last. We prioritize preparing the true HAC operations first, in order to reduce the risk of needlessly executing a promoted IOC operation that would require a lot of work to roll back. With this mechanism, the only way the IOC operation would ever have to be rolled back is in 3 cases. 1, if we cross a boundary where this specialized logic is not in place. 2, if there is more than one IOC promotion within our transaction, or 3, an end user decides to abort a prepared transaction. As a result, this mechanism could provide a reduction in operation rollbacks that is significant enough to make IOC promotion more practical. Now we're going to look at the desire for universal HAC. Although these two solutions that we just mentioned have some situational merit, it appears instead that an architectural strategy I call universal HAC is fundamentally demanded and in particular not subject to compromise. Universal HAC means opting into HAC everywhere by default. This is necessary to achieve arbitrary transaction composition, since the use of IOC in only a single location will poison any dependent systems. This poisonous effect propagates all the way up to the root transaction, forcing everyone to downgrade to IOC, and as a result breaking arbitrary transaction composition in the process. This propagating effect is analogous to the colouring of functions, which is a concept worth understanding in its own right. I'll leave a link to an article about that in the description, it's very interesting. So, by sacrificing universal HAC, it is impossible to have universal compatibility between transactions, instead leading to lots of messing about and developer frustration. Hence, one can only argue that universal HAC is not worth adopting if they argue that distributed transactions with arbitrary composition is itself not desired. This is a compelling argument in favour of universal HAC, given the usefulness of arbitrary composition. But with all that said, we must move on to the drawbacks of universal HAC. Unfortunately, it is not all fun and games. Let's consider the serious drawbacks of employing universal HAC. We've already touched on these challenges, namely negative performance implications and troublesome integration across what I call trust boundaries, so let's expand on these now. As for performance, I believe there is adequate room for improvement in this regard, noting that there is plenty of potential to optimize throughput independent of transaction time. The concept of HAC itself doesn't fundamentally close off room for performance optimizations, and so I don't consider this an inherent flaw. I intend to write a follow-up article at some point focusing on certain aspects of this. Instead, let's expand on the obstacle of trust boundaries as the focus for this video. Let's explore what it means to talk about trusted code. Trusted code is code that is within the control of a particular entity. We can assume that such code has no malicious intent and seeks to cooperate with the rest of the system. Logic that is within the control of an external entity, on the other hand, is considered untrusted from the perspective of another entity, and we can draw a trust boundary between these two entities. Naturally, untrusted code must often interface with trusted code. In this case, we must ensure there's no room for non-cooperation across the trust boundary. Common risks when crossing trust boundaries include failure to adequately validate and sanitize user input, and inadvertently exposing powerful interfaces that attract system faults, or that open up a gateway for malicious acts. In the case of HAC, there is a major requirement of cooperation across trust boundaries, surfacing as a critical barrier to universal HAC. Akin to the likes of cooperative multitasking, systems that follow HAC must be trusted to cooperate when it comes to transaction locking. They are required to manually give back control by committing or aborting operations that are in the prepared state. A single system can easily hog another system indefinitely, whether maliciously or due to an unintended error, by keeping a transaction in the prepared state. There is no simple mechanism to untangle this mess without cooperation between all parties. This is because it is merely impossible to forcefully abort an already prepared transaction without breaking all protocols and wreaking havoc. We must hold transactions in this safe preparation phase until absolute proof is coordinated amongst systems regarding its abortion. The chain is only as strong as its weakest link, said some random guy once many years ago. It is simply not safe to break the invariance regarding transactions. As such, it becomes impossible to demand universal HAC adoption, since crossing trust boundaries is something inevitable in any global system. We can't exactly use HAC internally either, given the chance of later expanding across a trust boundary. We can only consider HAC in situations where we're sure there's no realistic chance of ever crossing a trust boundary, or where the benefits of its usage outweigh the risk of a major redesign should a trust boundary later be crossed. So that was probably quite a lot to process, but let's now move on and look at the possibility of further research. So there appears to be conflicting forces when it comes to universal HAC adoption, which is exacerbated by its all or nothing approach. I'm convinced that further research in this area has the potential to reveal a solution to the primary complication of trust boundary cooperation. For example, I've been looking into ways of delegating the final commitment or abortion of transactions to a third-party system in such a way that it becomes difficult to hog transactions for an extended period of time. Transaction logic would have to be delegated to and executed by the system, but this would ensure that the system can safely release prepared transactions after a pre-agreed time limit. The third-party system could be implemented in a resilient and fault-tolerant way, where new instances can be dynamically spun up without needing cooperation between the other parties. I'm hopeful of further developments on this subject. Now let's briefly digress and look at some parallels with smart contract technology. So a lot covered in this video has connections with smart contract technology. A smart contract is essentially a unit of code that is run on a global trustless VM or virtual machine, where arbitrary transaction composition is supported between these smart contracts. Such machines can be thought of as the third party described just a minute ago. However, composition across VM instances is severely limited at this time. Current VMs strive to offer internal scalability only, rather than any sort of distributed scalability. The first of such smart contract VMs is the EVM, which is the Ethereum virtual machine, which has no horizontal transaction scalability at all. Whereas newer technologies like Solana have put major optimizations in place, such that internal horizontal scalability is achievable, provided there's enough state that isn't concurrently touched. And of course, scalability is a key focus for Ethereum development at the moment, so that will definitely improve as time goes on. However, we do not have distributed scalability across VMs themselves yet, and this particular area of research has piqued my interest over the last few years. Okay, right, so now I think it's time to recap everything we've covered in this video. So this may have been quite a heavy listen, so it'd be nice to quickly recap everything and make sure everything soaks in. So in this video, we explored the complexities of achieving distributed transactions, notably when integrating with legacy IOC systems. We began by defining and distinguishing transactions and distributed transactions, and summarized two basic mechanisms to implement distributed transactions, namely two-phase commits and transaction rollbacks. We defined some key terms such as IOC, immediate or cancel, and HAC, hold and commit, the former being a basic fire and forget approach that limits further composability, and the latter taking advantage of two-phase commits to support our composition goals. We examined two common strategies for dealing with legacy systems: limited IOC composability, which allows at most one IOC operation in a larger transaction, and IOC promotion, where IOC operations are wrapped to behave as HAC-like operations. We considered the architectural benefits of universal HAC, which allows for arbitrary transaction composition, but acknowledged the significant challenges faced once we consider performance and trust boundary cooperation. These limitations suggest that universal HAC, while appealing in theory, may not be practical just yet in the real world. So, in conclusion, achieving distributed transactions, especially in environments involving legacy systems, presents significant architectural challenges. While strategies such as IOC composability and IOC promotion offer partial solutions, they do not fully satisfy the need for seamless integration across independent systems. The concept of universal HAC, while theoretically ideal for enabling arbitrary transaction composition, faces practical barriers due to performance constraints and trust boundary complexities. These challenges suggest that while we have made great progress regarding distributed architectures, fully resolving the limitations of cross-boundary cooperation remains a matter for further research. The parallels with smart contract technology highlight a potential pool of developer interest when it comes to decentralized environments, but much remains to be explored before a universally scalable solution is realized. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you've enjoyed it. I put a lot of effort into writing the original article for this video and then putting it into video form. So I'd really appreciate it if you did enjoy to leave a like, maybe check out some more of my videos, and definitely leave some comments if you have any of your own opinions on this matter. You know, whether you agree or disagree with me on any of this, I'd really love to hear your thoughts. But yes, that does mark the end of this video, so thank you again for watching and I will see you all next time.